Hi, everyone. This is Jim Hessler from the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. We haven't done one of these YouTube conversations in a while with friends or fellow historians. So I am greatly honored today to be joined by my good friend and esteemed historian, Chris Mackowski. Now, probably to most of you, Chris does not need an introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyways. You see him very often on the American Battlefield Trust videos. He is a professor at St. Bonaventure University, but no doubt Chris is probably best known as the editor-in-chief and co-founder of the popular Emerging Civil War series, which he co-publishes through Savas Beatty. Chris is a prolific author, co-author, editor of nearly 24 books, and his most recent book is A Tempest of Iron and Lead, Spotsylvania Courthouse, May 8th through 21st, 1864, and that one was published by our mutual publisher, Savas Beatty. But today we're not going to talk about Spotsylvania, even though it's a battle that we enjoy, because this is the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk Gettysburg, but we're also going to talk Chancellorsville, which is another battle that is near and dear to our hearts. And we're going to focus on some of the impacts and connections between Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. So let me pause there. And first of all, Chris, hi, well, good to see you again, and welcome to the Battle of Gettysburg podcast on YouTube.
I am flattered to be here. I'm super excited to be hanging out with you. Just for folks in our viewing, listening audience, Jim Hessler is one of the greatest Civil War characters I know, and I am pleased to be his pal. So thanks for having me, man.
Stop. Chris, I didn't pay you to say that, did I? You just the natural. No, but thank you. Yeah, Chris and I go way back. We have a lot of things in common, including the Battle of Chancellorsville. So why don't we kick things right off? Chris, tell us, let's bring the listeners up to speed quickly. It's May 1863, of course, only 2 months before the pivotal Battle of Gettysburg. But what's the situation in May of 63 leading into Chancellorsville?
Honestly, I thought you were about to say the pivotal Battle of Vicksburg, and you got the wrong bird
Oh
there,
yeah,
which
I'm
is
sorry,
pretty
wrong
awesome.
podcast for that. Yeah.
So the Chancellorsville campaign really kicks off at the end of April, and Robert E. Lee has been waiting all winter long to find out what the Federal Army is going to do under its new commander, Fighting Joe Hooker. Hooker's really been trying to come up with some plans that will take the fight to Lee, and live up to his name, Fighting Joe. The Army of the Potomac has really had a tumultuous winter after its dispiriting loss at Fredericksburg the previous December, and Hooker's really spent all winter long rebuilding that into a fighting force. And I think that's really kind of the first place where we can have those resonances between Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, because the army that wins the Battle of Gettysburg is something that Joe Hooker makes leading up to Chancellorsville. It'll turn out he's the wrong guy to lead that army into battle, but the Battle of Chancellorsville shows that this is an army that is in fighting trim. It is ready to go. It is aggressive. It's got its ducks in a row, if you can let me use that cliche. And they just needed the right leadership, which it will eventually get just a couple months later. So Joe Hooker puts in plan a motion that he'd actually proposed the previous November to Ambrose Burnside, and Burnside said no. He's going to actually leave a decoy in Fredericksburg to distract Robert E. Lee, shifting his army to the north and west and kind of cross over three different fords that are going to allow him to concentrate at Chancellorsville, which is about 10 miles to the west of Fredericksburg, where Robert E. Lee's hanging out. And then he's going to move to the east and pin Lee against the Rappahannock River. And the enemy will have to ingloriously fly or turn and give battle on ground of our own choosing, where certain destruction awaits him, he boasts. And Robert E. Lee falls for the ruse. Joe Hooker doesn't get credit for pulling off this incredible movement through enemy territory, and is able to essentially get into position to strike Lee's rear. But because he concentrates on April 30th before striking forward, that gives Robert E. Lee the chance to realize, like, oh, wait, I have fallen for a ruse. That must be a distraction across the river. And that distraction, about 60,000 guys under John Sedgwick, they're beating their chest, they're marching around, they're looking threatening, they have credibly held Lee's attention. but they haven't done anything else. And so Lee's like, why aren't they attacking? And that's when he realizes that that's because this is a smokescreen. And so he's going to turn and shift his attention to the west and meet Hooker's oncoming thrust on the morning of May 1st. So that's sort of what sets us up for what becomes a cataclysmic battle between an undersized Army of Northern Virginia and a revitalized Army of the Potomac.
Well, that's interesting that you've led pretty much with the idea of the revitalized Army of the Potomac, because I think when people talk about Chancellorsville Gettysburg connections, so often they ultimately lead to the reorganizations in the Army of Northern Virginia. But you've led with the Army of the Potomac. You want to talk about some of the factors, some of the things you feel like Hooker did, as you said, to kind of build that army that comes into Gettysburg, and then we'll go back to the battle and what happens then after that.
Yeah, and these are really important reforms, some of them small, some of them big. Like one of the big things he does is he overhauls the intelligence service so that he starts to get accurate information. And the stuff that he gets from his new chief of spies, Sharp, brings in accurate stuff. He's got an order of battle for the Army of Northern Virginia that is extremely accurate and not overinflated. So that's kind of one big shift he does. Another is he reorganizes the Cavalry Corps. He's going to put it under the command of Brigadier General George Stoneman. Stoneman's going to underperform over the course of the campaign. That's going to set up the rise of Alfred Pleasanton, but it's also going to set up kind of the reorganization of the cavalry commanders that we know so well from the first day at Gettysburg. So it's really Hooker's reorganization of the Cavalry Corps that puts the people into place that are going to be able to set the stage for us when the armies get into South Central Pennsylvania. So that becomes another big major factor. Also, he's going to use that Cavalry Corps not just for screening, not just for reconnaissance, not just for protecting the wagon trains, which are, pretty traditional uses of cavalry, but Hooker actually, sends them all south on a big strike force. He sees them as a mobile infantry unit, essentially, sort of presaging some of the reforms that Phil Sheridan will bring in when he comes in 1864. So that's kind of a major rethinking of how cavalry is used. On a smaller level, he's going to institute corps badges. Dan Butterfield's going to help out with that. And the idea is we're just going to give everybody some sort of insignia that's a different shape and a different color, depending on their corps and their division. And they're going to sew it to their uniform. So we're not going to just be the sea of blue, but we'll be able to visually identify who belongs to what part of the army. And that really does a lot for esprit de corps. You'd think some patches, what big deal is that? But how many of you are really committed to your football team, your baseball team? And you think about your mascots and your logos. These corps badges have that same sort of effect to them. And then just on kind of a more even micro level than that, Hooker makes sure that there are fresh bakeries that are able to provide fresh bread to the troops every day instead of hardtack once a week. He institutes a series of furloughs so that if your regiment performs well, you will qualify to be able to go home for a little bit. That's really important because desertions, in December and January were really high before Burnside left. So here's a way for Hooker to try to get that under control and reward things. He spends a lot of time drilling these troops. He spends a lot of time just making them feel like respectable soldiers again. So that's kind of been infused in this army culture. And because he's fighting Joe Hooker, everyone's expecting, old Joe, he's going to take care of us. He's going to send us into battle. He's going to fight us well. When we forget this portion of what he does, which I think is masterful, rebuilding this army through all these different
Yeah,
endeavors, large and small.
you're right. Great points. I often think we should almost refer to him more as administrative Joe than fighting Joe, right? Because the administrative part goes well, and as you said, he takes a army that had been demoralized following Fredericksburg and the Mud March, and the early phases of his plan here to kind of get him behind Lee's army, they go well, don't they?
They do. He's able to successfully use Hooker use Sedgwick as that delaying force back in Fredericksburg, moving the rest of his army to get into position. And he pulls all that off, and he does a really great job. And, a lot of people say, well, why does he stop? In fact, George Gordon Meade, he says, why are we stopping? We've got the drop on Lee. Why aren't we pushing forward and taking advantage of this opportunity? But when Hooker hosted Abraham Lincoln in early April for a review of the Army and a tour. Lincoln took Hooker aside and said, when you give battle, put in all of your men.
Mhm.
One of the problems this Army's had, as huge as it is, as many resources it has, not everybody's getting into the fight. So that numerical advantage doesn't come into play. So use your numbers. When you get into battle, put in all of your men. So Hooker takes that time out so he can get his massive army together and be on the drop. He's following Lincoln's orders.
Yeah, you mentioned it. George Meade has probably one of my favorite quotes to the campaign, where when Hooker decides to pull back, Meade says something to the effect of, "How does he expect us to defend the bottom of the hill if we can't defend the top of the hill?" It's George Meade showing a little bit of a sarcastic sense of humor during this campaign that, of course, we don't see during as much during Gettysburg when he's the top dog and more pressure on him. But Meade commanding the Fifth Corps, we should mention that in case anybody isn't as familiar with the Chancellorsville order of battle.
And Hooker and Meade at this point have a pretty good relationship.
Yeah.
Meade is well respected by Hooker. Meade thinks that Hooker treats him well as a corps commander and as a recent major general. It's not until after the battle and people start talking about Meade as a possible replacement that Hooker gets jealous and their relationship sours. But on the eve of the campaign, these two get along real well.
Okay, yeah. So, there's always been some debate about whether or not Hooker actually uttered the famous quote that I lost confidence in Joe Hooker. But clearly, to the layman, Hooker seems to kind of lose his nerve here as we move into the first day. What's your take? What happens?
Yeah, and to me that quote, which he supposedly utters to Howard, which as a man he doesn't like at all, so I'm not even sure why he would be bearing his soul that way to a person he detests. Um, but it's an apocryphal quote, even if it's not true, because it does
Right.
sort of capture the sense that Joe Hooker's going into battle, and like that old saying goes, everyone's got a plan until you get punched in the face. And when Hooker gets punched in the face, he falls apart and he pulls back. And so instead of being on the initiative, he surrenders that initiative. He still, though, thinks that he's choosing the ground. He still knows he's got the bigger army. He's protecting his road network so that his lines of resupply and transportation, communication, and if necessary, retreat, they're all protected. He's operating in Virginia, so he knows that Lee's got to come at him at some point. So, I mean, Hooker does still think that he's holding a number of the cards, even though he does give up that initiative. We tend to criticize him like, oh my gosh, look at that. He lost the battle by giving up. He still thinks he's got some advantages in this fight.
Okay, how about the Army of Northern Virginia? How do they look at this point, specifically compare and contrast versus the Gettysburg campaign? But what's Lee kind of who's Lee got on his team at this point?
So it's been a hard winter for the Army of Northern Virginia because they've been hunkered down in this spot in around Fredericksburg all winter long, supplied by a single railroad that comes up from Richmond along the Fredericksburg Potomac and Richmond Fredericksburg and Potomac Railroad. And so as a result, he's had to spread his army out over a vast geographic distance to make sure there's enough forage for the horses. That's a particular concern. He sent a quarter of his army to the southeastern part of the state around Suffolk on a foraging mission. James Longstreet's down there with two of his divisions, Pickett and Hood. And so that leaves Lafayette McLaws and Richard Anderson as the half of the First Corps with Lee. And then his Second Corps commander, Stonewall Jackson, is on hand, and he's got his divisions of Raleigh Colston, Robert Rhodes, and A.P. Hill. A.P. Hill being the most experienced, the other two brand new to division command as this campaign gets underway. And so we'll kind of see how that plays out over the course of the battle. And we know that when Robert Rhodes shows up in Gettysburg, he has a really tough first day. But he shows enough promise at Chancellorsville. I think eventually he shows enough promise at Gettysburg that he gets to keep his job.
Mhm.
Colston is so disastrous as a division commander that he's gone within days after this battle. So Lee's really kind of figuring out how to work with an army and like 1.5 corps. He's got to serve not only as army commander, but he's got to serve as first corps commander, working with two division commanders he's never worked with. And because he splits the army here at Chancellorsville, he kind of has to work as a wing commander as well. So Lee's got a lot of command responsibilities he's not used to, and he's got to try to figure that out. And of course, we know when he gets to Gettysburg, he's still trying to figure out these command responsibilities.
Yeah, great points. And we always talk about Longstreet at Fredericksburg. Supposedly at Fredericksburg, Longstreet has learned the lesson of fighting on the defense, and supposedly that translates into how he counsels Lee, supposedly going into Gettysburg. But I always wonder, had Longstreet been at Chancellorsville, where you have Lee maneuvering and on the offensive and that sort of thing, I always wonder if that would have influenced how Longstreet ultimately did or didn't view what they quote unquote should have done at Gettysburg. Of course, we'll never know, but I think that's another factor that, very often people don't always talk about. They tend to overshadow Longstreet on the defense at Fredericksburg. And then, of course, Chancellorsville kind of becomes all Jackson, 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 right?
Yeah. And if you look at the dynamics here at Chancellorsville, where, who are the two division commanders that Lee has to work with? Anderson and McLaws. So when Longstreet comes back and he and Lee have a disagreement about how to maneuver at Gettysburg,
Mm.
and McLaws is literally right there as they're having this argument, and Lee essentially doesn't get the answer he wants from Longstreet, and he turns to McLaws and says, "What do you think? Can you do it?" And like undercuts his corps commander because now he's got a working relationship with a division commander that he didn't have before, and that stirs things up in Gettysburg in ways that, of course, then through after the battle, as everybody's pointing fingers, I think it all comes back really to Chancellorsville and the working relationship Lee has as a army slash wing slash corps commander with McLaws.
Right. And then don't you have some accusations that ultimately that McLaws, in Lee's view, McLaws might have been slow around Salem Church. And is that then play out into July 2nd at Gettysburg when Longstreet seems to be micromanaging McLaws? And there's some school of thought that, Longstreet might have been told by Lee, look, I wasn't totally happy with McLaws. You keep an eye on him here. Do you think there's some factor in that as well?
I think that there might be, and everything that happens at Salem Church is just kind of a big, confusing, tangled mess for Lee, and in part because he's just having to really move on the fly. For folks who kind of overlook that part of the forgotten front, as Chris White and I like to call it, on the 3rd of May, after things have essentially calmed down at the Chancellorsville intersection, Sedgwick makes his move in Fredericksburg, comes through Fredericksburg, captures Marie's Heights, and then moves toward Chancellorsville. So Lee sends McLaws out to intercept him at Salem Church, where he's able to link up with Cadmus Wilcox. So it was a fantastic day on the 3rd of May. And then Jubal Early, who'd been holding the defenses in Fredericksburg, slipped out of the way, comes in behind Sedgwick. So we've got really disorganized commands between Early, McLaws, and Wilcox. They don't have good routes of communication. So when Lee goes to that part of the field to take control, he sees that there are very disjointed attempts to try to put the squeeze on Sedgwick, who's able to escape.
And true story, because my wife Michelle, the first time we ever went to Salem Church, and we had been through the whole battle at Chancellorsville and explained how Lee kept dividing his forces and pushing the Yankees back. And then we went to Salem Church and we talked about basically Sedgwick trying and then ultimately not being able to get through. It was the only time in my life I ever heard my wife express frustration at a Civil War battle where she actually threw up her hands and said, "Oh my God," like in frustration when we told her about Sedgwick at Salem Church. So, folks, that's how frustrating that battle is for the Union cause right there, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you can explore that battlefield today in the paved parking lots of many strip malls.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can. I think there's the furniture store across the street. I mean, there's all kinds of good
There's
stuff
a
there.
Taco Bell at a Union artillery
Yeah.
position, so.
Don't get us started. We like Taco Bell, so
Well, actually, I do too,
yeah, let's not go too far here, folks. But all right, so I know we've been skipping around a little bit, folks. We're just doing an unscripted conversation here. How about should we go to May 2nd? Of course, the
Yeah,
day that is so often remembered as Jackson's flank march and everything that ensues there. You want to kind of just pick up the pieces a little bit on May 2nd, and then maybe we can talk about some of our friends in the 11th Corps and things like that.
yeah. If I was wearing a hat, I would take my hat off at the mention of the 11th Corps. They have such an unfortunate day. Lee and Jackson, when they converge on the night of May 1st, Lee's looking to pick up that initiative that Hooker has surrendered. And so they come up with a plan to get Jackson in and around essentially the rear of the Union Army. We call it Jackson's flank attack because it sort of looks like he's marching out to the flank. But if you look at the way that Hooker actually is going to array his army, anchoring it on the Rapidan River to the north and a creek down in the south, he really kind of has a nice relatively straight line that is facing McLaws and Anderson, who are now serving as decoys for Lee on the Chancellorsville front. So when Jackson makes his move, he's really getting to the rear of the Union Army. Nobody's expecting troops to be back there. Reports that come in about this movement seem to suggest that Lee's retreating and that the fighting going on with McLaws and Anderson is really just Lee's rear guard protecting what is turning out to be a retreat. And Hooker convinces himself that, oh, yeah, okay, well, we're going to go after these guys tomorrow. Start cooking up your rations, get ready. We're going to squash this little bug in front of us today, and we're going after the main column tomorrow. So that's why he's unprepared. And he's got all the way down the chain of command. A lot of denialism going on. There's maybe a suggestion that Howard, Oliver Otis Howard, commander of the 11th Corps, tucks away an order and doesn't actually pass it along, and then brings it out conveniently later, like, oh, wow, look at this, So there's lots of confusion about what exactly happens in the command structure in the 11th Corps, but we know that they're unprepared and there's some willful deniability out there. And so when Jackson hits them and rolls the 11th Corps up, send them flying pell-mell to the east, it's something that they really aren't able to defend against because the terrain out there is so bad. And again, if we look ahead to Gettysburg, the 11th Corps is going to be put in a position where the terrain is so bad and be expected to hold. So, I always invite people to come to Chancellorsville and walk that ground, and you'll see that there's no place for the 11th Corps to really rally. They try a couple times, but Jackson's fist is so strong when he hits, he's able to not only just smash defenses, but outflank defenses and keep driving forward. And so this becomes the big story of Chancellorsville, is how Jackson miraculously appears on the Union flank, drives them in, and then it's only through some freaky act of God that he's shot by his own men. And that's what then kind of ends the Battle of Chancellorsville. And everyone forgets about May 3rd and we go to Gettysburg. That's the popular story.
Yeah, ain't that the truth? Couple comments there talking about the denialism and the fact that Hooker is being fed intelligence to the effect that Jackson is presumably in retreat. We would be remiss on the Battle of Gettysburg podcast if we didn't do a Dan Sickles report and point out that among those feeding Hooker that misinformation would in fact be Dan Sickles, who sees Jackson's corps and trains passing by his front and contributes to this idea that he thinks the Confederates are in retreat. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say that.
But I give Sickles props at Chancellorsville. And
what?
he's a guy that's easy to make fun of, and there are other places that we can tease him a bit. But he's showing an aggressiveness because he does spot Jackson's column moving, and he's like, I want to go get him. And Hooker's like, oh no, they're retreating. Let him go. We're gonna do. And Sickles like, no, no, come on, let me go, let me go. And he's allowed to first open fire with artillery. Then he's given permission to move forward with his infantry, and he feeds men into a fight that then Lee has to kind of hold off. So like Sickles is showing the sort of aggressiveness that this army really needs, that the men in the ranks really want. He makes the right moves on that 2nd of May.
Hey, I love it that I did not have to be the one to say that, right? But in all fairness, I often feel like depending on quote unquote what Chancellorsville book you're reading, some books kind of interpret this as, as you said, Sickles being full of fight. Other books, I don't want to quote authors because I may get it wrong and I don't want to misquote anybody. Other books tend to take more of the, cocksure and untrained Dan Sickles was fighting for the sake of fighting, kind of thing. So okay, sounds like I'd put you more in the camp of that you feel like his moves down to from Hazel Grove down into the, towards into Jackson's rear, so to speak. Some merit in that
I
thinking.
do. I think that he exemplifies the sort of fight that this army wants to have, and I would argue needs to have at this point. Um, So yeah, good stuff. And then, and in
Nice.
fact, he calls for reinforcements. He
Yes, it
gets
does.
part of Howard's corps to come down and help him out. Like he really wants to prosecute this fight. Now, what that ultimately does, though, is it moves the whole Third Corps to the south, out of position from the rest of the army. So when Jackson hits the 11th Corps in the west, drives them off the field, he then gets to the part of the field where the Third Corps should be, and they're not there. And so Jackson's able to get more free real estate as a result of Sickles. And today we can say being out of position, but I think Sickles was where the fight was. And so I wouldn't say he was out of position, except that Jackson shifted the position.
Okay. And, then as you well know, and I want to come back to Howard, but let's stay on this Sickles thread for a minute. As you well know, then in later years, Sickles and Pleasanton in particular kind of tried to position themselves as taking a lot of the credit then for stopping a lot of the momentum of Jackson's attack. Is there any truth in that? Is that all, bluster and fluff? What do you think?
I would say that's all bluster and fluff for two reasons. One, he's out of position, and so he's really not in the fight with Jackson's flank attack on the second. And then when he tries to get into position to fight them for the third, Hooker moves them. And so, Jackson's, by that point, Jackson's flank attack has transformed dramatically, and Sickles has some, important role to play still, but he really doesn't do anything to blunt Jackson's attack at all.
So now we're back to the Dan Sickles we know and love, the bluster and the fluff and all of that stuff. All
Which,
right.
which, of course, makes him easy to love and also easy to hate. He's almost his own worst enemy because he does have things we really do need to credit him for. It's just hard to sort through the bluster to find those
Yeah,
things.
we always say the man you either love to hate or hate to love, right? It's one or the other. So well, how about all right, so I don't want to lose the thread on Howard in the 11th Corps because there's a obviously the history of it in terms of Howard in the 11th Corps and the immigrants became scapegoats and things of that nature. I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but overall, first, what's your assessment of Howard and his part in the debacle? And then what's your assessment on the fighting qualities of the 11th Corps in general? Because again, these are going to be a lot of psychological factors that will then transfer over to July 1st at Gettysburg.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a huge cultural disconnect between Howard, old prayer book, they call him, from down East Maine, and he's super serious, super pious. And his fighting men, Germans, 60% of the guys in the Corps are German. So that's not an entirely German Corps. But, these, hard drinking, hard living German immigrants, many of them don't speak English. It's just a big disconnect. And many of them are resentful that the person that they do love, Franz Siegel, has been replaced by this outsider. So, there's just a lot of that. So it creates some friction between Howard and some of his brigade commanders, some of the men in particular. They just don't love the guy. They're not ready to fight Smith Howard, the way they were with Siegel. With Siegel. One thing I will give Howard some credit for here, and again, trying to be fair about it. When Sickles calls for reinforcements, Howard is going to lead Barlow's brigade down to reinforce Sickles at Catherine Furnace. And he does that because that's where the action is. Howard believes that his place is at the front with his men. And so he's going into what he thinks is the battle. So it's not like he's necessarily, again, out of position. He's where he thinks he's supposed to be. And so he gets back to the battlefield as Jackson's flank attack is underway, and he tries to rally his men. He's so mortified. He says later on that I wished I could die, and he looks to find death on the battlefield. But he wants to do the right thing. He wants to rally his men. He wants to be in the fight. There is also that whole thing like, the road to hell's paved with good intentions. So like his good intentions maybe only go so far. But I don't think it's a character flaw on his part, at least.
Okay. And the fighting qualities of the immigrants, ultimate of the 11th Corps, ultimately, do they get a bad rap?
They do. And look what they do when they get shifted out west. Like the 11th Corps does great work when it gets shifted around, becomes part of the 20th Corps. Like, so I think it's just a matter of poor leadership, caught by surprise, hard to give orders to guys that don't understand you in the heat of battle, no place to rally. I mean, it really is a perfect storm of just bad circumstances for these guys, and they do get a bum rap as a result. Now, perhaps had they performed differently at Gettysburg and been able to redeem themselves at Gettysburg, they wouldn't have carried that shroud with them. But they're in essentially the same situation at Gettysburg, where they're put on an unprotected flank of the army on terrain that is undefendable, and then are caught by a sneak attack,
Mhm.
by the Confederate Second Corps. Like, let's just carry that right out. So history repeats itself 2 months later in similarly dramatic and catastrophic fashion. So they're going to carry that and carry that and carry that.
Yeah, not only do they carry it, but then you have on July 1st at Gettysburg, you have guys like Slocum saying later, I was hesitant to come up to the field and take over from Howard on quote unquote another Chancellorsville. So you have the memory of all of this impacting what people are doing at Gettysburg. And boy, we haven't even gotten back to Sickles yet, which we will do in a few minutes. But before anyone accuses us of spending too much time on the Army of the Potomac and Sickles and Hooker or that, let's just pivot back to Lee and Jackson for a minute. Do you think, it's often said, again, you have the maneuver, the flank attack, inferior numbers versus superior numbers, all of that stuff going on at Chancellorsville. Do you ultimately think Lee's plan of attack on July 2nd at Gettysburg is ultimately influenced by the success of Jackson on May 2nd at Chancellorsville? At the end of the day,
Um,
a flank attack is a flank attack. But what do you think?
yeah, I think in part, yes, because he does have success at Chancellorsville and he is able to pull it out. I would argue, though, that Jackson getting wounded when he does is probably the best thing that happens to Lee at Chancellorsville, because if Jackson continues his attack, he's going right into the jaws of the Fifth Corps, the First Corps. He's going to be surrounded by parts of the 12th and Third Corps. So like, the math doesn't look pretty good. So it's really kind of like Jackson's wounding, and I'm a Jackson fanboy. If folks don't
I know
know
you
that,
are,
the
right.
man is
I'm
dear to my
shocked.
heart.
I'm even
Uh,
shocked that we're having this conversation.
yeah.
Yes, yes.
But it's a good thing he's taken off the battlefield when he is for Lee. So I don't think Lee fully appreciates when he gets to Gettysburg. I don't think he fully appreciates the ramifications of what could have gone wrong with Jackson's flank attack. And I think that also is a blind spot as he's thinking about what he does on July 2nd.
Yeah, and even then Jackson's Chancellorsville March becomes Longstreet's counter march, and there's just all kinds of things that ultimately work on May 2nd, but don't work on July 2nd. Okay, so with the wounding of Jackson, obviously there's going to be significant reorganizations in the Army of Northern Virginia. Maybe we'll come back to that at the end here. But anything else you can think of on May 2nd that we've kind of neglected to just cover, or anything you want to talk about there?
Yeah, I mean, the story really is kind of the flank attack, but
Mhm.
one of the things that always amazes me a little bit, I guess, as a historian of the battle, is that after Jackson's wounded, people tend to forget about May 3rd.
Yeah.
In which to me, May 3rd is a huge, huge story. It's the second bloodiest day of the Civil War. It just has catastrophic effects on the Army of Northern Virginia in particular. And we're just going to skip over that part. That's not convenient. Let's get to Gettysburg,
Right.
And so
Right.
I think, talking about May 3rd is super important, because that's really where the battle's won or lost.
Okay. Well, then let's go to the morning of May 3rd. What does the Union position look like on the morning of May 3rd?
So picture like a big U that has a pimple on the tip of it. And Dan Sickles is that pimple, you know?
Ouch. That's just not right. Okay. We'll continue. Go on.
Um, but Sickles is occupying an excellent piece of ground. It's the highest piece of ground on the Chancellorsville battlefield. It's an open piece of ground, which is pretty rare at most of Chancellorsville. And so, even though he's on the essentially an exposed bulge on the tip of this U, it's really important to hold this ground, he believes, because if he gives it up, the Confederates could use that as an artillery platform to bombard the rest of the Union position. So he's out there holding on to this spot. And Joe Hooker comes to pay a visit to him just before dawn. And Hooker's like, "Yeah, this is a great spot. Wow, I want you to pull back." And Sickles like, "Well, what do you mean?" And Hooker believes that piece of high ground is too exposed, and so Sickles can't defend it because he's vulnerable from attack from nearly all sides, and Hooker can't really defend that position very effectively as well. And so he's afraid that essentially, I'm going to hate to use this metaphor, he's afraid that the Army of Northern Virginia is going to pop the pimple. And so he says, pull back, strengthen the U, and let's be in a more fortified position that allows us to support each other better. So I understand Hooker's rationale, and hindsight lets us know that Sickles was right and Hooker was wrong. Because Sickles, as he's pulling off that piece of high ground, Confederates launch their morning attack, and they essentially get that piece of high ground for free. There's a bit of skirmishing there between Archer's brigade and the Orange Blossoms, but the Sickles guys pull out, and Confederates get this artillery platform. The one spot on the battlefield they have to have, and they essentially get it for free. And they do exactly what Dan Sickles said. They park a bunch of cannon up there and start bombarding the Federal line.
Okay, and the piece of high ground that Chris referred to, obviously the infamous Hazel Grove. When I do Gettysburg battlefield tours, a good portion of my tours, not all of them, but I'm often requested to do Sickles specific topics or Peach Orchard specific topics. And of course, the number one thing, well, not the number one thing, but certainly in the top five, I think the number one thing people always ask me is what the hell was Dan Sickles thinking? Maybe 1A or 1B then comes down to Chancellorsville. And do we think the peach orchard at Gettysburg is basically Hazel Grove in reverse sort of mentality? I get that question all the time. I've answered it in writing. I've answered it on tours. Chris Mackowski, emerging Civil War. What do you think?
I get that question often as well. Although I do get people who come down here and they're like, wow, I hadn't thought of that. But to me, it's a pretty obvious connection if you're really studying the battles. And we don't, to the best of my knowledge anyway, we don't have anything in writing where Sickles is like, I remembered Hazel Grove, and so I went out to the peach orchard.
That's the
But
problem, right?
but if we think about it, in both instances, Sickles saw a piece of high ground in advance of the main Union line that could be used as an artillery platform against the Union position. And by occupying it, he denies that artillery platform to the enemy. So in both situations, that's what he sees. At Chancellorsville, he's told, no, 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 we're fine. He gives it up, and of course, the Union Army suffers the consequences. So when he sees that high ground at the Peach Orchard, he already knows what's going to happen if the Confederates park cannon there. So he moves forward, I think, in a justifiably understandable way to occupy that ground because he understands what the consequences could be.
Okay. And we should point out from Lee's perspective, Lee does want the Peach Orchard and the Emmitsburg Road Ridge. Lee uses the phrase gain the Emmitsburg Road for exactly that reason, to use as an artillery platform. So you might wonder if Lee is remembering a little bit of Chancellorsville as well. But you hit it on the head. The problem is we don't have an account from Sickles that says, yes, I was remembering Hazel Grove, but 2 months to the day, more or less, 2 months to the day plus a day.
Yeah.
It makes logical sense from that perspective.
I do think that if, like, on his deathbed, if someone went up and said, Dan, is this what you were thinking? He'd be like, of course it was. That's what, like,
Give me a cigar. Let's talk
that's
about
right.
this.
Totally would have claimed credit for it.
So do you cut Sickles any slack then for the move at Gettysburg, or do you feel like no, at the end of the day, orders are orders, and because that's obviously the flip side of it. Orders are orders, and he is not obeying General Meade's orders. But do you cut him any slack because of Hazel Grove or not?
I understand why he did it. And I even give him a little slack because he did try to be like, well, send someone down here to look at this. If you don't believe me, like, bring Warren down, somebody, come look at this. And Meade's pretty dismissive of that. And so I still sort of believe the orders are the orders thing. But Meade bears a lot of the blame for that as well,
Ooh,
because,
you're gonna get some heat for that, Chris.
I know,
I
I know, and
know.
I
You're
like
gonna
Meade.
get
I
heat.
like. I really like Meade a lot. After reading his letters to his wife, I like that dude a lot. But, there is something to be said about, Sickles is not part of the West Point Boys Club. Meade's got a lot of contempt for him, and lots going on for me to pay attention to on July 2nd. So I can see where he's like, geez, this guy again. So I understand both perspectives there. Um, so it's just one of those unfortunate, like,
Yeah, I think what you said there is right. At least trying to understand both perspectives. I think that's the best thing we can do as historians. Who's right, who's wrong? Yeah, we're not all, but at least trying to understand the perspectives on it. Because as you said, you get a lot of people who come out on the field that A are like, I never thought of it, or B, they're coming out with a misconception like, well, this guy just wanted to destroy the army, or ridiculous thing. He wanted to be president. I've heard all kinds of ridiculous things. So at least the perspective, and that's why it's important. Getting back to our theme here today, I think you'd agree to study and understand multiple battles. Because certainly with Gettysburg, we can often be accused of or guilty of looking at everybody's performance based on 3 days at Gettysburg. And when you look at these prior battles in particular, you better understand the decisions and the actions and the things that led up to it.
Yeah, and like we have the benefit of knowing how the story ends. Like I'm
Yeah.
sure if Joe Hooker knew that May 3rd would end the way it ended, he would not have pulled Sickles off that hill. He'd have come up with some other alternative, right? He doesn't know what the ending's going to be, so he does what he thinks in the moment is in the best interest of the army.
Okay. All right. Well, I feel like people are going to say we talked too much about Sickles, so maybe we'll move May 3rd along a little bit. You want to just then real quick in a nutshell, what is Lee doing on May 3rd and how does it end for Hooker?
So Jeb Stuart's going to have to take over for the fallen Stonewall Jackson. And so rather than continue Jackson's attack, Stuart understands just how precarious the Second Corps is because they've got basically, the Army of the Potomac sitting in the middle of the battlefield with Lee on the far side, Stuart on the west side, and that it's a big, viable, angry, wounded bear, really, that could turn and take a swipe at Lee or could turn and take a swipe at Stuart. So they've got to get reunited. Lee recognizes this as well. So we're not going to continue Jackson's attack. We're going to then shift to the south, back to the Catherine Furnace area where Dan Sickles, I'm going to get his name in one more time, was fighting the day before. And they're going to link up with Lee. And then Lee and Stuart are basically going to try to squeeze the U. They've got exterior lines, they've got fewer men, but they've got great artillery positions that they're able to bring in with converging fire from two different artillery platforms. And here's where, I think one of Hooker's failings comes in. We talked about the reorganization of the Army. His artillery commander, Henry Hunt, is someone Hooker doesn't get along with. He doesn't like the way that Hunt manages the artillery. So he has sent Hunt to the rear to oversee artillery emplacements at some of the river crossings. So when this squeeze comes from the Confederates, at first the Federals are able to resist, but then they start running out of artillery ammunition. And Hunt's not there to send that ammunition to where it's needed. Hooker is cut off his nose despite his face in this instance. And so as the artillerists start to run out of ammunition, they start to pull back. That means the infantry doesn't have support. And Lee's attacks on the morning of the 8th are pretty much just forward charge, forward charge, forward charge, forward charge, breakthrough, and that's kind of how things work. And so as the Union Army starts to kind of tumble back from this breakthrough, they try to dig in again. That's where Confederate artillery moves forward. Hooker is nearly hit by a shot, and the ramifications of that do knock him senseless. At the peak of battle, when the army is in dire need of leadership, its leadership is essentially decapitated because he's knocked senseless. Doesn't give command to his second in command, Darius Couch, and as a result, the Federal position ends up collapsing and falling northward into a more condensed position, a little closer to the river. And Lee is able to ride into the Chancellorsville intersection about 10:30 in the morning with his men clustered around him, screaming wildly at their success. The Chancellorsville mansion in flames behind him. And this is sort of where that legend of Robert E. Lee really crystallizes. And one of his subordinates later says, this is where men had the dignity of gods, looking
Yeah.
at Lee sitting there on his horse, overcoming incredible odds of more than 2-1 to secure what becomes a victory.
A personal anecdote. I never really got or appreciated Robert E. Lee until about 20 years ago when I started studying Chancellorsville and that sort of thing. And to me, that was really the one battle that made me say, wow, I get it. I get it. For all the reasons we haven't gone into any of the cliches today about dividing your force in the face of a numerically superior enemy, but just seeing the way Lee kept doing it again and again at Chancellorsville, that was always the one battle for me that got me saying, okay, okay, I get Robert E. Lee, because if you only study Gettysburg, which nobody would agree, Gettysburg is not Lee's greatest battle. You're not going to find anybody who's going to agree to that. If you only study Gettysburg, you don't get Robert E. Lee, and this is one of the reasons again why I'd encourage people to look elsewhere to better get that.
And he's got to take these wild risks. He does have to divide his army three times in the face of a numerically superior foe, but he takes calculated risks. So, like when Jackson makes his flank attack, if something goes wrong, that's also the route to escape to Gordonsville, where there are trains and a railroad system that Lee can use to get out of Dodge. So it's not like, Jackson's suddenly putting himself in peril by being way out there. So we get to see not just the boldly, but the calculating shrewdly, which is something I think a lot of people over forget. At Gettysburg, we get to see the sick to his stomach with dysentery Lee and how grumpy he is, and that's a different Lee. I don't see any statues of that Lee anywhere. We should have a statue of that Lee someplace.
Yeah, we should. All right. How about back to Hooker? Back to Hooker. So he's been defeated. What started off so promisingly only a few days before is now ending in disaster and humiliation. Hooker calls all the generals together, doesn't he? And has the effect of a war council to decide whether or not we're going to stay or retreat across the Potomac. You want to talk a little bit about that? Because you touched on it earlier, the Meade and Hooker relationship. And I think a lot of it, again, starts to fall apart with the implications of this meeting.
Yeah, the Council of War is in a lot of ways a disaster for Hooker because his corps commanders want to stay and fight. Dan Sickles kind of puts his finger up to the wind and he says, maybe we shouldn't because we're kind of beaten up. I don't think it's cowardice. I think that's just political shrewdness on his part. Dan Butterfield, the chief of staff, is like, no, we need to withdraw. But all the other corps commanders are like, we need to fight. Like Meade has hardly been engaged. He wants to go in. John Reynolds, hardly been engaged. He falls asleep in the meeting. But ahead of time, he told Meade, send us in. Howard, he's humiliated. He wants to redeem his reputation. He wants to go in. And Hooker's like, oh, thank you very much. Well, let's pack up and go. And this really undercuts everybody's confidence in him because then what happens is this army does retreat and nobody wants to serve under Hooker because they're not confident in his abilities. They're not confident that he's listening to advice when he asks for it. They see that he got too shaken up and didn't bounce back, didn't lean on the people who could help him. And so now he's got to fight essentially an insurrection within his officer rank because, everybody either wants to transfer. Slocum says he refuses to serve under that man again. Couch asks for a transfer and ends up in Harrisburg, and so it really becomes a problem. And then like Hooker alienates people because he blames all this on John Sedgwick, you know, he blames all this on George Stoneman and on Oliver Otis Howard, all three of whom do share some degree of blame. Sedgwick perhaps least of all, and because Sedgwick is so loved, the other officers are like, wait, and I'm like, you can
Don't
say
talk
this
to Uncle
about what you
John.
want.
Yeah,
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 that's right,
yeah,
but
yeah.
not Uncle John, for God, and so Hooker really does himself no favors with his officers as a result of this meeting.
Yeah, some great points there. And of course, when Couch leaves the Army of the Potomac, who gets promoted in his stead? Winfield
Yeah, so
Hancock, right?
we get
Commanding the
we get the
second
rise of
force.
Hancock. Yeah.
Yeah, and and I've always argued from the Army of the Potomac perspective, Gettysburg is in a lot of ways Hancock's battle, even though he doesn't command the army the way the movie makes it sound, but just Hancock's performance on the first 3 days. If this doesn't happen, we might be looking at, a statue of Darius Couch on East Cemetery Hill instead of Hancock.
Yeah.
So it's a big deal there. How about
Well, and I
when
think too, like when Hooker gets replaced,
Mhm.
Couch would have been first in line for command. He could have been commanding the Army of the Potomac
Yeah,
again.
yeah. That was a point I kind of ponder myself. Obviously when Meade does get put in command, he leapfrogs over a couple of senior guys like Slocum and Sedgwick, and I always kind of wonder would they have put him over Couch, or would Couch have been the guy? But yeah, it could very well be Couch commanding the Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg, as you say. How about, and related to that though, with Meade, how about when things start appearing in the newspapers to the effect of Hooker followed the advice of his corps commanders in retreating across the Potomac? And of course, one of the guys who objects strenuously to this is George Meade. Right. And doesn't Meade kind of confronts Hooker to the effect of, that I counseled you to stay and fight. And Hooker and Sickles takes Hooker's side. They kind of say, well, no, George, you started counseling that we stay, but then you kind of changed your mind. And I think a lot of that not only torpedoes the Hooker Meade relationship, but this idea of Meade being weak and indecisive is then something that his critics and his enemies will, like Sickles and Butterfield, will play on after Gettysburg. It's a straight line from Chancellorsville.
It is. And it's important to remember that Hooker created an environment around his headquarters where the correspondents were hanging out, drinking beers, and having a good
Yeah.
time, right?
Yeah.
And so after Chancellorsville, that's a sympathetic audience to Hooker. And so they're going to do kind of their part for their drinking buddy to cover some of that stuff up and, put his side of the story out there with a bit more prominence. And so it really is one of those instances of the biased media who are biased toward Hooker. And I think one of the things I really admire about Meade is he's a man of deep principle, and he's an incredibly highly professional soldier. And I think it just rankles his sense of duty to hear that, he and his fellow corps commanders were essentially slandered in such a way. They did their duty. Hooker chose not to take their advice, which he was entitled to do, but then to try to gaslight everybody about it. That's the exact kind of thing that would set old Peppery right off.
Yeah, and of course, the most direct straight line, obviously, is then over the ensuing month, we're going to start to lose confidence between Hooker and Lincoln and Halleck and everything going on, which ultimately will lead to Meade being in command of the Army of the Potomac. So we touched on Meade, we touched on Couch and leading to Hancock and all of that stuff. Anything else we should cover in the Army of the Potomac before we go back to Lee's army and their reorganization?
Yeah, I think that ultimately the Army of the Potomac leaves Chancellorsville feeling as though it was not beaten. Like they met defeat, but they weren't beaten. They were ready to keep fighting. The men are really dispirited by the fact that they have to withdraw. And so I think that really puts that chip on their shoulder when they go to Gettysburg. They're ready for this rematch, and they're the ones who get the good ground this time,
Yeah.
and they demonstrate what they're fully capable of.
Okay. All right. Army of Northern Virginia. It's been well said and well documented. Obviously, Jackson's death, and Lee was thinking of reorganizing the army anyways, but we would be remiss if we did not touch on this. You want to talk about the reorganization of the Corps following Jackson's demise?
Sure, sure. And to me, the most important thing about this too is like everyone focuses on Jackson, but let's remember that Lee has lost since taking over, right after Seven Pines. Since taking over, he has lost 60,000 men, including 300 field grade officers, right? So, like, Lee has lost an army's worth of army in the previous year. So when we look at this one casualty of Stonewall Jackson, which again, it does have its implications, Lee has bled this army out significantly. He goes into this battle with 130 regiments. He loses 63 regimental commanders at Chancellorsville. He goes in with 28 brigades, loses 9 brigade commanders. Some of those brigades go through multiple commanders. Sam McGowan's brigade, they go through 5 brigade commanders in 15 minutes, right? So not only have we lost a huge amount of just infantry, we've lost a lot of experienced officers all up and down the chain of command. So what we see at Gettysburg is a diminished army that has finally hit its peak. And it just doesn't have the gas to get over the line at Gettysburg because it's been bled out so bad and it's loss of manpower and experience. And Gettysburg's where we first really see the implications of that. And Lee knew this was going to happen. That's why he's always looking for that knockout blow because he says, the longer this lasts, the
It's
worse
gonna
it's
go
going to
on.
get on us, right?
Right.
So, Jackson's fascinating to focus on, but really, it's these numbers that are the story of Chancellorsville and its implication going forward for the Army in Northern Virginia. And we see that immediately when Lee does reorganize the Army, and we're going to have Longstreet come back. Longstreet wants to go out west and help alleviate the pressure on Vicksburg, and Lee's like, I can't lose your experience and I can't lose your two experienced divisions. I can't let you go. So, Lee hatches onto them, choosing Virginia over Mississippi. And we know how that's going to then play out in a couple months. So that's got huge implications as a result of this battle. But then who are we going to put in charge after Stonewall Jackson? It's going to be Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill, both of whom are fantastic at the division level, untried at the corps level. Most importantly, though, both of those men, having served under Jackson, are used to an explicit, direct command style. You will do this at this time with this many men, having your shoes buttoned this sort of way after you've eaten this and said your prayers, right? Like we're going to have super detailed instructions. That's what Jackson was. So when Lee takes command, he's like, I'd kind of like this maybe to happen if you can. Like Ewell and Hill don't know how to operate. It is not their fault. And this is, and this is something you hear in leadership training today, where you've got to cultivate your successors because Jackson's a perfect example. He's gone. The people who take over for him don't know how to operate. And so Gettysburg is a huge lesson for Lee in how do I operate this newly structured army with these new commanders who are in positions that they're probably capable of filling, but we just haven't really had the chance to sit around the fire and talk,
Right.
you know?
Right. Right. I think,
So,
those are great points. I think when we so studiously study our orders of battle at Gettysburg, whether it's for the guide exam or for whatever purpose, I don't think as we're memorizing this name goes here and this name goes there, I don't think people realize how many of those names are in that position for the first time. Like you said,
yeah.
9 out of 28 at the brigade level. I don't even know what the number is in the Army of the Potomac, but you don't realize when you come into Gettysburg on July 1st how many of these guys are commanding at a brigade, at a division, at a corps level in a major engagement for the first time. And once again, a lot of that being a direct result, obviously, of the huge casualties at Chancellorsville.
Yeah. And we see when Ewell goes to Second Winchester, and he does a great job,
Yeah.
great start to the campaign. That's exactly the kind of stuff he'd been doing under Stonewall Jackson, right? So we've got a finite mission where he's got a little bit of independent command. Of course he does well. But then when he gets into that larger scheme of the army and the communications with the other corps commanders and with Lee, then we're starting to get like, well, I never done this before.
Let me put you on the spot here. A little fantasy Gettysburg. We've played fantasy Civil War together before. No, folks, that's not as dirty as that sounds. But commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia, Chris Mackowski, would Ewell and Hill be the guys you would pick?
At that point, yes, I think they
Yeah.
would be like because there's everything to recommend them at
Right.
that point. We don't
Right.
know that Hill is going to be a super hands-off corps commander, because he's really good at the division level. I mean, Ewell's got a fantastic reputation. If you read the newspaper accounts of the Valley campaign, um, like Ewell is frequently mentioned alongside Stonewall Jackson
Mhm.
in all these great successes that are going out there. Like he's considered a national hero in the spring of '62. Of course, he's a guy that you're going to tap for that job. So I think it's just a matter of okay, so we've promoted them. What are we going to do to help them succeed? That's the part that's missing. And you know whose fault that is?
Or- yeah. Well, you already took heat for bashing Meade, so we won't take you too deep down the Lee rabbit hole either. But out there. All right. A couple last points. I was just thinking, this morning, kind of prepping for the conversation, any other commonalities? We've talked about Meade, we've talked about Slocum, Sedgwick, obviously all guys that play critical roles at Gettysburg. George Green builds what they describe as rifle pits and at Chancellorsville, and of course, those turn into breastworks on Cults Hill. Again, in my view, no coincidence there that you see the same guy doing that. But also medals of honor. There are how many medals of honor? I think is it 26 awarded for Chancellorsville? I know the numbers in the 20s.
Yeah,
But yeah, I just like to point out to people there's a couple of names that we're really familiar with from Gettysburg that received that medal for actions at Chancellorsville. John Buckland is one on the artillery side. Another one, John Chase, who many of us know at Gettysburg. He's the guy who supposedly gets killed and then rises up from the dead and says, "Did we win?" A lot of people don't realize that John Chase received a Medal of Honor, not for Gettysburg, but for Chancellorsville.
which is on display at the Chancellorsville Battlefield
That's
Visitor Center,
right.
along with his walking stick. It's what an incredible pair of artifacts. And then you see his picture and just how shot up he was. Like it's an amazing display.
Yeah, it is. I'm glad you mentioned that. It's Dilger, 11th Corps Artillery, Medal of Honor for Chancellorsville, St. Clair Mulholland. There's probably a few others that I'm forgetting, but I like to point that out because again, we, meaning my side of the fence, we think of these guys as Gettysburg guys, but here they are receiving our highest military honor for Chancellorsville. So just pointing that out too.
Yeah. And you think about, these are guys, all of these are guys who go through this over and over and over. They've been
Mhm.
going over and over and over for how many unrelenting months? And think
Yeah.
about all the unsung, unawarded, unrecognized acts of valor that go on battle after battle after battle. I mean, to me, it's incredible.
Well, I think that's a great point. I think we should segue and do a part two on this, where we'll go now from maybe like Gettysburg to the Overland Campaign or something of that, which again I know is in your wheelhouse, and maybe we'll see what happens to a few of these guys at the Wilderness and wink wink Spotsylvania and beyond. Maybe we could do something like that. Any closing thoughts? I know we've had you for about an hour here. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's just I think Chancellorsville is one of those really easy opportunities if you're looking to expand your Gettysburg knowledge. Um, so many connections, so many resonances that, if there are another 3 days you want to study in the war, just back up to May of 1863, and you'll just see so many different things that happen here that echo forward in ways that I think will deepen your understanding of what goes on in Gettysburg.
Yeah, could not agree more. Chris Mackowski, Emerging Civil War. Thank you for joining us on the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. This is the first time you and I have done this for me. Usually I'm coming on your show, so I appreciate it, and I thank you very, very much for taking an hour or so of your time to talk with us about Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. Thanks.
It's my privilege, Jim, always. Thank you so much.